Today in the EU, push for permanent recovery and resilience facility faces scrutiny amidst 600 million euros fraud in Italy. The EU's economic chief, Paolo Gentiloni, called for turning the bloc's recovery and resilience facility RRF into a permanent resource, saying that in that way the program would unleash its full potential. However, the European Court of Auditors are warning about the risk of frauds when it comes to EU funds after the cases investigated in Italy and Greece. Hello and welcome. I am Eva Chiori and this is Today in the EU. So today we're mixing things a little bit because the topic has so many different angles. And to break it down, we have with us the entire Economy Hub, Anna Brunetti, Thomas Moeller Nielsen and Jonathan Packroff. Anna, let's start with what is the Recovery and Resilience Facility?
So the Recovery and Resilience Facility is an historic deal that was struck by the three EU institutions in 2020 during the pandemic. And it was the first time that there was such a EU-wide fiscal facility to help member states overcome the headwinds and the risk coming from the pandemic crisis. The way it was set up was made up of 723 billion euros, so a massive amount for this kind of joint borrowing project. And it was split into two parts. The first one would be 338 billion in grants, and then there were the portion represented by loans that will need to be repaid, and that one was 385 billion of euros.
What are the main funds?
Member states can apply to the funds based on specific necessities and needs linked to economic problems showing up in different sectors and different parts of the economy. To do so, obviously, they need to show evidence of projects and planning ahead. And also the disbursements of the fund and the allocation of the funds is conditional on enacting several reforms. Usually it will be about structural reforms. It could be anything from reforming a certain sector and the way it's set up to broader pension system reforms. So I guess the idea of these reforms is to make that country economy more resilient longer term.
Which EU member states profit from these funds?
So the largest beneficiary is Italy, which was the country that was first hit by the pandemic and the hardest hit at the beginning. So far, it has been allocated 194 billion, which corresponds to 10.95% of its GDP. The second biggest beneficiary is Spain, which was allocated 163 billion, which is equal to 13.51% of its GDP. And finally, Greece was allocated 35.9 billion, which is equal to as much as 19.66% of its GDP.
And where are these funds coming from?
So again, this is the first time that the EU is actually issuing joint debt through the Commission. So the Commission goes to the markets to issue bonds that will then finance the entirety of the facility.
Now, coming to you, Jonathan, the EU's economic chief, Paolo Gentiloni, has expressed his suggestion to make the Recovery and Resilience Facility into a permanent financial resource.
I have no doubt that the EU will benefit hugely from a permanent safe asset commensurate with the size of its economy. And this will be a big issue to discuss for the next Commission,
said the Commissioner for Economy, Paolo Gentiloni, earlier this week.
I'm equally convinced that our end goal should be the establishment of an EU-wide central fiscal capacity. This is crucial to provide European public goods in areas such as energy, innovation and defense.
What would that mean and how would it work?
The argument brought forward by Gentiloni was that the recovery fund has actually helped Europe to recover quicker from the pandemic and from its economic impact than it was previously with the financial crisis, where it took 7 years to really bring the economy back to the same level as before. And after the pandemic, it was actually already reached in 2021. That was his argument. A lot of it was also psychological because the EU was able to show that they are united in their response. and they wouldn't impose strict austerity measures like they did in the financial crisis or in the Eurozone crisis that followed. And then if you want to have a permanent fund, or if you continue with spending this, then it means you can continue to invest in these priorities that the EU has also set out.
And Tom, things aren't this simple because there are rules to be defined, and there is a whole discussion going on regarding the role of private money. Can you give us the details on this?
So there's been a big push among European policymakers over the last several months to encourage the private sector to make the investments required to facilitate to facilitate the green and digital transitions. And part of this is because there were these recently agreed fiscal rules that were agreed in trilogue discussions a few weeks ago, and that basically limits member states' ability to make these sorts of investments. So there's been a big interest among European officials in integrating what's called the Capital Markets Union, basically integrating the single market for capital as a way of sort of harvesting or generating the private funds required to make these sorts of investments. Now, the RRF obviously is public money, so that's why there's a lot more sort of renewed interest in the RRF as an additional source of public funds, precisely because these fiscal rules are limiting member states' ability to make these sorts of investments.
Now, there is yet another scandal unpacking, in Italy this time, that involves the RRF. This comes after the Greek case of the 2.5 billion euros that is being investigated, as it was reported by the Greek newspaper Kathimerini at the end of March. You've been covering the Italian case, so what is it all about?
So on the 4th of April, the European Public Prosecutor's Office reported that they had uncovered an alleged embezzlement of 600 million euros from the RRF facility. It involved the arrests of 22 individuals across 4 different European countries, so Italy, Slovakia, Romania, and Austria. And basically what had happened was these individuals had set up these fictitious companies. They had claimed that what they were doing is they needed these grants, these non-repayable grants from the RRF to allow these companies to access foreign markets. And they created fake bank statements, fake profit margins, and so on and so on and so forth. And it was uncovered. It was discovered by Italian prosecutors. What was interesting about this particular scandal was that 2 weeks before that, the European Court of Auditors president, Tony Murphy, had explicitly said that there was a heightened risk of irregularity or even corruption in the disbursement of these funds, precisely because it's member states really that are responsible for making sure that the money is appropriately spent. And the European Court of Auditors has repeatedly said that many member states can't be trusted to monitor that these funds are really spent appropriately. So it was quite a prescient prediction, I would say, from him. And after the scandal broke, we interviewed him earlier this week, Tony Murphy, and he said that he wouldn't be surprised if such a scandal happened again.
Right, you're mentioning the possibility of such scandals, but on what does this possibility depend on, and what are the main factors?
Precisely because the monitoring these funds is largely a responsibility of member states. The question of whether or not these funds are spent appropriately depends on how trustworthy a particular member state is. Now, obviously, some member states are better at combating corruption and embezzlement than others. EPO, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, they published a report last month where they said that there have been more than 200 cases, or they're pursuing more than 200 cases of corruption, fraud involved with these Next Generation EU programs, of which the Recovery and Resilience Facility is the kind of flagship initiative. The vast majority of these cases are in Italy. So I guess it's not really that surprising that this massive scandal broke in Italy, of all places.
And these events lead to a lot of criticism of the suggestion to make the Recovery and Resilience Facility permanent. So, Jonathan, who are the voices that are already against or skeptical on this proposal, and what is their argument?
I think there are kind of 2 arguments. I would say at the heart of it, there's really like an ideological discussion of what should be the role of the state and how much of the investments that are certainly needed. And I think nobody would doubt that the investments are needed. But the question is how much of it needs to be really public investment. And the counter argument is you can actually do a lot more with private investments if you deepen capital markets, for instance, which is something that a lot of policymakers are now shifting their attention to. And if you have carbon pricing, that means that the fossil fuel alternatives that are currently on the market are becoming more expensive. That also drives private investments into green alternatives. For instance, if your heating gets more expensive, your gas or oil heating that you have at the moment, then you might look into installing an alternative with your own money, or maybe you go to a bank and get a loan for that. So this is how you can mobilize private investment, which is by companies, but also by private households. But then, of course, the argument for the prolongation is this is a bit unfair because then you leave it to individual households and companies to do the investments, and this could lead to really an unfair burden for some. So this is why you need more public investment. So this is really an ideological debate.
Anna, what else could we add to this point?
It's really like a principle-based debate on what kind of economic model you believe in. And that's why the discussion is in itself really vital for the way the European project will be structured going forward.
Now, the truth is that the reactions to these proposals aren't something new. The Recovery and Resilience Facility has been the bone of contention for many since the very beginning of its existence. Anna, can you remind us what has happened so far and what's the reason behind the reactions?
The reason why it is really interesting to debate and to kind of look at what is happening on the RRF discussion is that what is really at stake, it's a much longer lived European debate on not only how crisis should be tackled, but really on what economic paradigms those joint decisions should be based on. To give you a little bit of an historical context, it's really interesting to see how Europe has decided and agreed upon on how to tackle the pandemic crisis, especially when we compare it to how it tackled the financial crisis of 2008 and in specific the European sovereign bond crisis in 2012. So what happened in the aftermath of the financial crisis was that the lack of a pre-established framework for managing economic crisis in Europe meant that, for example, when the continent went down the austerity route, those kind of austerity-based measures compounded economic national problems. And the role of negotiating terms for loans and assistance was assigned to the so-called Troika, which basically was a trio represented by the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF. But the fact that this Troika took on that role created a lot of long-lasting political ramifications and spurred a very heated debate on the democratic basis of the process. And we can still see the effect of that debate to date. On another level, it's really interesting because the debate at stake is really between those advocating for economic orthodoxy, and those countries are usually called the frugal countries, and then we have those calling for more Keynesian approaches to a crisis, which involve a larger role for the state and for public and fiscal funding. So basically, we've seen the second one prevailed in this case of the pandemic crisis. And it was really an historic shift because we saw Germany, a long-lived frugal supporter of economic orthodoxy, finally approving and endorsing the plan that was initially put forward by Macron. At the time, it was brokered by Macron, and it was finally supported by the then German Chancellor Angela Merkel. So it really marked an historic moment. And we're now seeing the discussion being reopened because obviously the scheme is due to end in 2026. And it's definitely promising to reopen that longer-lived debate among those two fractions of Europe, I guess.
And the reactions move beyond the think tanks and analysts because there are opposing opinions within the European Parliament regarding the necessity of a new funding program post-2026. So what's the reason for the opposition?
Well, according to the Court of Auditors, one danger of not extending the program beyond 2026 is that it puts a lot of pressure on member states to apply for these funds and for the funds to be dispersed to member states. And that risks overwhelming many member states' capacity in order to be able to process these funds, which again heightens the risk of corruption or irregularities. So that's one possible danger. At the same time, my impression is, just from their perspective, they're very cautious about calling for the program to be extended because obviously if the program is going to be extended, that means, at least in its current form, that means that a lot more money is probably going to end up going missing. So there's quite a balance to be struck here. On the one hand, they don't explicitly say that they want the program to end, but certainly your impression from talking to them is that they have a lot of reservations about it being extended. So there's a real balance to be struck here. And if I'm perfectly honest, I don't really understand, or I myself don't really know what the right way forward is.
Thank you all for joining me on this episode. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. Also, make sure to leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us to spread the word about our content. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Sainz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in, and we will be back on Monday morning. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.